The rescue helicopter pilot couldn't believe what he was seeing through his thermal scope. 3 days after Sergeant Audrey Parker had gone missing during a reconnaissance mission in the mountains of Eastern Europe, there she was, not hiding, not cowering, but moving with calculated precision through enemy territory. What made it even more incredible was that this was the same soldier her own unit had nicknamed Porcelain, because they thought she was too delicate for real combat. For 72 hours, she had not just survived behind enemy lines, she had turned the tables on her captors and gathered intelligence that would change the entire course of their operation. But to understand how the fragile communication specialist became a one-woman force of survival and strategy, we need to go back to where it all began, in the rain-soaked training grounds of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where preconceptions and prejudices would nearly cost everyone everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Kentucky morning was brutal, with rain turning the obstacle course into a muddy nightmare that had already claimed 3 twisted ankles and 1 dislocated shoulder. Sergeant Audrey Parker adjusted the straps of her communications pack for the 4th time, trying to find a position where the 40-pound radio equipment wouldn't dig into her shoulders during the upcoming field exercise. At 5'3" and barely 120 pounds, she looked almost comically small next to the towering soldiers surrounding her, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by her new unit. "Parker, you sure you can handle that pack?" Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson called out, his voice carrying just enough concern to sound official rather than mocking. "We can't have our comms going down because someone can't keep up." Audrey had heard variations of this question every day since arriving at Fort Campbell 2 weeks ago. Alpha Company of the 3rd Battalion was an elite reconnaissance unit known for their deep penetration missions into hostile territory. They were used to working with hardened soldiers who could march 20 miles with full gear and still have energy left to fight. Audrey Parker, fresh from the Signal Corps School at Fort Gordon, didn't fit their image of what a combat-ready soldier should look like. "I can handle it, Sergeant," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the familiar knot of frustration building in her stomach. She'd graduated at the top of her communications class, could operate radio equipment that most soldiers couldn't even identify, and had volunteered for this assignment specifically because she wanted to prove herself in a combat unit. But none of that seemed to matter when measured against her appearance. Corporal Jake Williams, a mountain of a man from Alabama who served as the unit's designated marksman, shook his head with what might have been sympathy. "Look, Parker, no offense, but this isn't Signal Corps training. We're talking about real missions, real enemies, real bullets. Maybe you should consider requesting a transfer to a support unit where what?" Audrey interrupted, her patience finally wearing thin. "Where I'll be safe, where I won't slow anyone down, where I can stick to nice clean communications, work away from the scary combat operations." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drumming of rain on equipment and the distant sound of another training unit working through their exercises. Several soldiers exchanged glances, and Audrey could practically see them cataloging this moment as evidence of her emotional instability under pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the battalion commander, had been observing from a distance, but now she approached the group with the measured stride of someone accustomed to diffusing tension. At 38, Mitchell was a career soldier who had earned her position through competence and determination in a field still dominated by men. She understood better than most the challenges Audrey was facing. "Parker," Colonel Mitchell said, her tone neutral but carrying authority, "what's your assessment of our current communications setup for today's exercise?" Audrey looked around at the assembled soldiers, each carrying different pieces of equipment. For what was supposed to be a 48-hour simulated deep reconnaissance mission, she could see the obvious problems immediately, but pointing them out would mean criticizing the choices made by senior NCOs who already doubted her presence. In the unit. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Granted. The frequency allocation is going to cause interference between the long-range radio and the GPS units, Emma said, pointing to specific pieces of equipment. Staff Sergeant Johnson's radio is set to a frequency that will create crosstalk with the navigation system every time we try to transmit our position updates. Also, the backup communications plan assumes we'll have line-of-sight contact with the base station, but the terrain we're going into has too many ridgelines for reliable contact below 4,000 feet elevation. She paused, watching the faces around her. Some showed surprise, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of blank expression that meant they had no idea what she was talking about. Additionally, Emma continued, the encryption keys for the secondary radio haven't been updated in the field manual distributed to the squad leaders. If we have to switch to backup communications during the exercise, half the team won't be able to decrypt incoming messages. Colonel Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. How long did it take you to identify these issues? About 30 seconds after I saw the equipment layout, ma'am. The colonel turned to Staff Sergeant Thompson. Marcus, how long has this communications plan been in place? Thompson shifted uncomfortably. About 6 weeks, ma'am. We've been using the same setup for the last 3 training exercises. And have you experienced any communications problems during those exercises? Well, yes, ma'am, but we attributed them to equipment malfunctions and atmospheric conditions. Colonel Mitchell looked back at Audrey with something that might have been approval. Parker, fix it. For the next hour, Audrey worked through the communication setup, adjusting frequencies, updating encryption protocols, and redistributing equipment to optimize both weight distribution and signal reliability. She worked with quiet efficiency, explaining changes to the soldiers who would be carrying the gear while making notes about backup procedures and emergency protocols. What impressed Colonel Mitchell most wasn't Audrey's technical knowledge that was expected from someone with her training. It was the way she handled the obvious resistance from some of the soldiers. When Corporal Williams questioned why he needed to carry an additional piece of equipment, Audrey didn't argue or appeal to authority. Instead, she demonstrated how the equipment would allow him to call for precision fire support in case of enemy contact, turning his objection into enthusiasm. When Staff Sergeant Thompson expressed concern about the complexity of the new procedures, Audrey created a simplified checklist that reduced the decision-making process to a series of clear yes or no questions. She adapted her expertise to the needs and capabilities of the people who would have to implement her solutions, but not everyone was convinced. Sergeant First Class David Park, a veteran of 3 deployments who served as the unit's intelligence specialist, watched Audrey's work with undisguised skepticism. This is all very impressive for a training exercise, Park said as Audrey finished explaining the backup communication procedures. But real combat isn't about perfect radio protocols. It's about staying alive when everything goes wrong, when your equipment fails, when you're cut off from support, and running low on ammunition. It's about physical endurance, mental toughness, and the ability to make life or death decisions under extreme stress. He gestured toward Audrey's small frame. No offense, Parker, but you look like a strong wind could knock you over. What happens when we're 30 miles behind enemy lines? You've been awake for 48 hours, and we need to move fast across rough terrain while carrying wounded soldiers? What happens when the enemy is shooting at you and you can't hide behind radio equipment and technical manuals? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Audrey could feel the weight of expectation from the entire unit. This was the moment where she would either earn their respect or confirm their doubts. Sergeant Park, Audrey said quietly, you're absolutely right that real combat is different from training exercises. Equipment fails, plans fall apart, and people get hurt. But you're wrong about one thing. She picked up her communications pack. now properly configured and weighing 43 pounds with the additional equipment she'd added to improve functionality. Without visible effort, she slung it onto her shoulders and adjusted the straps with practiced ease. I'm not hiding behind technical knowledge. I'm using every tool available to keep this unit alive and mission capable. Yes, I'm smaller than most of you. Yes, I probably can't carry a wounded soldier the same distance you can. But I can ensure that when someone does get wounded, the medevac helicopter will know exactly where to find us. I can make sure that when we need fire support, our coordinates will be accurate and our request will get through. And I can guarantee that no matter what goes wrong with our primary equipment, we'll still be able to communicate with base. She paused, meeting Park's skeptical gaze directly. As for physical endurance and mental toughness, I guess we'll find out during the exercise. But I'd like to point out that you've been using faulty communications procedures for 6 weeks and didn't realize it until someone half your size showed up and fixed the problems in an hour. The tension in the group was almost palpable. Several soldiers looked uncomfortable with the direct confrontation, while others seemed to be reassessing their first impressions of the quiet communications specialist. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward before the situation could escalate further. All right, people, we've spent enough time talking. Let's see how these new procedures work in practice. Alpha Team, you're moving out in 15 minutes. Exercise begins now, and it runs until 0800 Wednesday morning. As the soldiers dispersed to gather their gear and conduct final equipment checks, Audrey found herself alone with her pack and her doubts. She'd handled the technical challenges easily enough, but Sergeant Parker's questions about physical endurance and combat performance echoed her own private concerns. She was confident in her communications abilities, but this was her first assignment with a frontline combat unit. What if they were right? What if she really wasn't strong enough, tough enough, or resilient enough for this kind of work? The rain continued to fall as Audrey conducted her own final equipment check, ensuring that every piece of communications gear was properly secured and functional. Around her, the other soldiers prepared for what would be a challenging but ultimately routine training exercise. None of them could have imagined that in less than 2 months, Audrey Parker would find herself alone behind enemy lines in the key mountains of Eastern Europe, with nothing but her supposedly fragile determination and her communications expertise standing between her unit and total disaster. But that crisis was still in the future. For now, she was just a small soldier with the big radio pack, trying to prove that she belonged in a unit that had already decided she didn't. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 48-hour training exercise would become legendary within Alpha Company, though not for the reasons anyone expected. What began as a routine reconnaissance simulation in the Cumberland Mountains evolved into a test of everything the unit thought they knew about capability, leadership, and the true meaning of strength under pressure. Audrey Parker found herself assigned to Bravo Team, led by Staff Sergeant Thompson, along with Corporals Williams and Davis, and Private First Class Martinez. The team's mission was to establish a forward observation post 12 miles into the mountain terrain, maintain surveillance on a simulated enemy position, and relay intelligence back to battalion headquarters for 36 hours before extraction. From the moment they crossed the start line, Audrey could feel the subtle ways her teammates were compensating for what they perceived as her limitations. Williams automatically took point, setting a pace he assumed would be challenging but manageable for the fragile communications specialist. Davis positioned himself between Audrey and the most likely direction of simulated enemy contact. Even Martinez, despite being junior in rank, seemed to hover protectively nearby. The irony wasn't lost on Audrey. These men who had spent weeks questioning her belonging in their unit were now unconsciously reorganizing their tactics to protect her. It was well-intentioned but professionally insulting, and it was about to become a serious tactical liability. 3 hours into the movement, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of rocky terrain, Williams called for a halt to check their position. The GPS unit showed they were nearly a mile off their planned route, having followed what appeared to be an established trail rather than the direct bearing that would have taken them to their objective. "We're behind schedule," Thompson announced, studying the map and GPS coordinates. "At this rate, we won't reach the observation post until after dark, which puts us behind our timeline for intelligence collection." Audrey had been tracking their position continuously using her own equipment, a habit developed during Signal Corps training where precise location data was critical for establishing communication links. She'd noticed the deviation 20 minutes earlier but had hesitated to speak up, knowing that challenging the navigation decisions of senior team members would likely be interpreted as questioning their competence. But watching Thompson struggle with the GPS coordinates while Williams defended his route selection, Audrey realized that her silence was serving no one. The mission was more important than hurt feelings or wounded pride. "Sergeant Thompson," Audrey said quietly, approaching the team leader with her own GPS unit and map. "I've been tracking our position, and I think I can get us back on course." Thompson looked up from his map with barely concealed frustration. "Parker, I appreciate the offer, but navigation is Williams' responsibility. He's been doing this for 4 years." "Yes, Sergeant, but the trail Williams has been following curves north toward the old logging roads. It's a natural route, but it's adding significant distance to our movement. If we cut directly east from here across this ridgeline," she pointed to a contour line on the map, "we can reach the objective in half the time." Williams studied the terrain she was indicating, his expression skeptical. "That's pretty rough country, Parker. Steep climbs, loose rock, no established paths. Are you sure you can handle that kind of movement with your equipment load?" The question contained layers of assumption that made Audrey's jaw tighten. Williams wasn't just questioning her route selection. He was questioning her physical capability to execute her own plan. More importantly, he was making tactical decisions based on his perceptions of her limitations rather than on mission requirements. "Corporal Williams," Audrey said, her voice taking on an edge of authority that surprised even her, "I'm not suggesting this route because it's easy. I'm suggesting it because it's correct. We have a mission timeline to meet, and taking the long way around isn't going to accomplish that." She spread her map on a flat rock and began pointing out specific features. "This ridgeline provides natural concealment from the objective area, which means we can move during daylight without being observed. The trail you've been following crosses 3 open areas where we'd be visible to anyone conducting counter surveillance. Additionally, the ridge route puts us above the objective with a clear line of sight for communications and observation." Davis, who had been listening silently, leaned over to study the map. "She's right about the exposure on the trail route. I was thinking the same thing, but didn't want to second-guess Williams." Thompson looked between the 2 routes, weighing the tactical advantages against the physical challenges. The decision he made next would set the tone for the rest of the exercise, and though he didn't know it yet, for the rest of Audrey's time with the unit. "Parker takes point," Thompson announced. "It's her route. She navigates. Williams, you're rear security. Davis and Martinez maintain interval. We move in 10 minutes." The climb up the ridgeline was everything Williams had warned. It would be steep, rocky, and demanding. But as they ascended, something remarkable happened. Audrey, carrying her 43-pound communications pack, set a pace that was both sustainable and efficient. She chose routes that minimized energy expenditure while maintaining the correct bearing. Most importantly, she demonstrated an understanding of mountain navigation that went far beyond reading GPS coordinates. "How did you know about that natural ledge?" Martinez asked during one of their brief rest halts, referring to a sheltered platform Audrey had led them to that provided perfect concealment and a clear view of their back trail. Topographic maps show elevation, but they don't show everything, Audrey replied, checking her GPS and adjusting their next bearing. Rock formations create natural platforms at certain elevations. If you know how to read the contour lines, you can predict where they'll be. Williams, who had been skeptical of the entire route, found himself reassessing his assumptions as they made steady progress toward their objective. Not only was Audrey handling the physical demands of the movement, she was navigating with a precision that made his own GPS-dependent navigation look amateur by comparison. They reached the observation post 2 hours ahead of schedule, with enough daylight remaining to properly establish their position and begin intelligence collection. The location Audrey had selected provided excellent visibility of the target area, while offering multiple escape routes and natural protection from enemy observation. As they settled into their surveillance position, Thompson pulled Audrey aside for a private conversation. "Parker," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. That was some of the best land navigation I've seen from anyone in this battalion, and I've been doing this for 12 years. Audrey appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in the tactical situation developing in the valley below them. Through her binoculars, she could see the enemy position that served as their surveillance target, but she could also see something else that didn't match their intelligence briefing. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, "we might have a problem." Thompson followed her gaze and studied the target area through his own optics. According to their briefing, they were supposed to be observing a static enemy position with minimal activity. Instead, they were looking at what appeared to be a much larger and more active operation than expected. "That's not what we were briefed to expect," Thompson muttered. "Davis, get me a count on personnel and vehicles." As Davis began his detailed observation, Audrey was already setting up her communications equipment to report their findings to battalion headquarters. But when she attempted to establish contact, she encountered the same type of problem that had plagued the unit's previous exercise: intermittent connectivity and poor signal quality. This time, however, Audrey was prepared. She quickly deployed the additional antenna array she had configured before the mission, adjusted the transmission frequency to account for atmospheric conditions and terrain interference, and established a clear, strong communication link with the base station. The intelligence they transmitted over the next 6 hours would fundamentally change the nature of the training exercise. What had been planned as a routine surveillance mission became an intensive intelligence-gathering operation that tested every aspect of the team's capabilities, but more importantly for Audrey, it became the moment when her teammates stopped seeing her as a liability to be protected and started recognizing her as an asset to be utilized. Williams began consulting her on navigation decisions. Davis asked for her input on observation techniques. Even Martinez, the junior member of the team, started treating her as a subject matter expert rather than someone who needed constant assistance. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no speeches about equality or acknowledgments of past mistakes. Instead, it was a gradual recognition that competence comes in many forms, and that the smallest member of the team might also be one of the most capable. As night fell, on their first day in the observation post, Audrey maintained communications with headquarters while her teammates rotated through security and surveillance duties. The steady stream of intelligence they provided was painting a picture of enemy capabilities that far exceeded anything the training scenario was supposed to include. What none of them realized was that this exercise was serving as preparation for something far more serious than routine training. In just 6 weeks, Alpha Company would receive deployment orders for a real mission in a very dangerous place. And the lessons they were learning about Audrey Parker's capabilities, both technical and personal, would prove to be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But for now, perched on a mountainside in Kentucky, Audrey was simply doing her job with the quiet competence that had carried her this far. The doubts and assumptions of her teammates were beginning to crack under the weight of observable reality. Soon, they would shatter completely under the pressure of actual combat. The second day of the exercise would bring new challenges and deeper tests of the team's cohesion. But Audrey Parker had already proven the most important point. She belonged here, and she was just getting started. 6 weeks after the Cumberland Mountains exercise, Alpha Company received orders that would change everything. The morning briefing at Fort Campbell felt different from the routine training sessions they'd grown accustomed to. Colonel Mitchell's expression was serious, and the intelligence officers flanking her carried themselves with the tension of people dealing with real-world consequences rather than training scenarios. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell began, her voice cutting through the usual pre-briefing chatter, "what I'm about to tell you is classified secret, and it doesn't leave this room. We have a situation developing in the Balkans that requires immediate attention." The room fell completely silent. Audrey Parker, now seated with her team rather than isolated in the back, felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. Real missions meant real stakes, real enemies, and real bullets. Major Christine Roberts, the battalion intelligence officer, stepped forward with a map of Eastern Europe. 3 days ago, a NATO monitoring station in the mountains near the Kosovo-Serbia border went dark. The facility was conducting surveillance on suspected arms trafficking routes used by hostile forces in the region. Initial satellite reconnaissance shows evidence of an attack, but we don't know the status of the 12-person international team stationed there. She pointed to a specific location on the map, a remote mountain valley surrounded by peaks that rose over 8,000 feet above sea level. The monitoring station is here, approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest NATO base, in terrain that's been contested by various factions for the past decade. Weather conditions have prevented aerial reconnaissance, and the approaching winter is making helicopter operations increasingly dangerous. Colonel Mitchell took control of the briefing again. Alpha Company has been tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission to determine the status of the monitoring station, assess threats in the area, and if possible, extract any surviving personnel. This is not a training exercise. The forces operating in this region are well-armed, experienced, and hostile to NATO presence. Audrey found herself studying the terrain features on the map with professional interest. The mountain ranges reminded her of the Cumberland exercise, but the scale was much larger, and the isolation more complete. Communications would be challenging in that environment, with limited line of sight, opportunities and significant potential for interference from the surrounding peaks. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had developed a healthy respect for Audrey's tactical insight since the training exercise, caught her attention and nodded toward the map. He'd learned to read her expressions when she was analyzing technical challenges, and he could see her mind working through the communications problems they would face. Major Roberts continued with the operational details. Intelligence suggests that the attack on the monitoring station was carried out by a paramilitary group with significant military training and equipment. They've been operating in the region for several months, targeting NATO installations and aid convoys. We believe they have access to advanced communications intercept capabilities and surface-to-air missile systems. The implications were sobering. This wasn't going to be a mission where superior technology and firepower would guarantee success. They would be operating in enemy territory, against an opponent who had chosen the time and place of engagement, with limited support and uncertain communications. Alpha Company will deploy in 2 teams, Colonel Mitchell announced. Bravo Team, led by Staff Sergeant Thompson, will conduct the initial reconnaissance and establish a forward observation post. Alpha Team will provide overwatch and serve as the primary extraction force. The mission timeline is 72 hours maximum. We get in, assess the situation, and get out before weather conditions make helicopter extraction impossible. Audrey felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd volunteered for elite unit assignment to participate in. But it was also the ultimate test of everything she'd been trying to prove about her capabilities. After the formal briefing, Thompson gathered his team for detailed mission planning. The group now included Audrey, Corporals Williams and Davis, Private First Class Martinez, and 2 new additions, Specialist Jennifer Hayes, a medic, and Sergeant Michael Chun, an explosives expert. The team composition reflected the serious nature of their assignment. "Parker," Thompson said, spreading detailed topographic maps across the planning table, "I need your assessment of communications challenges for this operation. We're going to be operating in terrain that makes the Cumberland Mountains look like a parking lot." Audrey studied the maps, noting elevation changes, ridge lines, and the positions of known communication towers in the region. The monitoring station's location was particularly challenging, situated in a valley that was surrounded by peaks on all sides, creating a natural communications dead zone. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, tracing her finger along the topographic lines, "standard RADIO communications are going to be severely limited. The monitoring station is in what's essentially a bowl surrounded by mountains. We'll need to establish relay positions on these ridges here and here to maintain contact with base." She pointed to 2 specific peaks that would provide line of sight. "Communications paths. That means splitting the team," Davis observed, studying the distances involved. "We'd need at least 2 people at each relay position to maintain security." Audrey shook her head. "Not necessarily. I can set up automated relay stations with equipment timers and signal boosters. As long as we can get to these positions during the initial insertion, I can establish a communications network that will function without permanent personnel." Chun, the explosives expert, looked skeptical. "How reliable would an unmanned relay system be? If those positions are compromised, we lose all communications." "Which is why we establish multiple redundant paths," Audrey replied, pulling out her communications planning notebook. "Primary relay here, secondary relay here, and emergency backup using satellite communications if everything else fails. The key is building redundancy into the system so that single-point failures don't leave us completely isolated." Specialist Hayes, who had been quiet during most of the planning discussion, spoke up. "What about medical evacuation communications? If we have wounded personnel at the monitoring station, we'll need reliable contact with extraction helicopters during potentially hostile weather conditions." Audrey had already been thinking about that exact scenario. Medical evacuation gets priority on all communication systems. I'll configure the radios so that medevac requests automatically override all other traffic and transmit on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Even if we lose primary communications, medical emergencies will still get through. Thompson listened to this exchange with growing confidence in his team's capabilities. The training exercise in Cumberland had proven that Audrey's technical expertise was valuable, but this mission planning session was demonstrating something more important: her ability to think tactically about communications as an integral part of overall mission success rather than just a technical requirement. "What about the intelligence suggesting that hostile forces have communications intercept capabilities?" Williams asked. "If they're monitoring our radio traffic, couldn't that compromise our operations?" "Definitely a concern," Audrey acknowledged. "We'll use encrypted communications for all operational traffic, change encryption keys every 12 hours, and employ burst transmission techniques to minimize the time our signals are vulnerable to interception. Additionally, I'm bringing equipment that can detect if our communications are being monitored, so we'll know if we've been compromised." The detailed planning session continued for 3 hours, covering everything from equipment loads to contingency procedures. What impressed everyone was how seamlessly Audrey's communications planning integrated with the tactical requirements of the mission. She wasn't just thinking about radio frequencies and signal strength. She was considering how communications would support movement, medical evacuation, fire support coordination, and intelligence collection. As the team prepared to leave the planning session, Thompson pulled Audrey aside for a private conversation. "Parker," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you're not going on this mission because we need someone to carry a radio. You're going because you're a critical member of this team, and your expertise might be what brings everyone home alive." Audrey felt a warmth of recognition that went beyond professional acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sergeant. I won't let the team down." "I know you won't," Thompson replied. "But I also want you to know that this mission is going to test all of us in ways we can't predict." The intelligence briefing made it clear that we're going up against an experienced, well-equipped enemy in terrain that favors defenders. Everything we do over there is going to matter. 3 days later, as Alpha Company loaded onto the transport aircraft that would carry them to their staging area in Germany, Audrey reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed. 6 weeks ago, she'd been the unwelcome outsider struggling to prove she belonged. Now she was an integral part of a team preparing for a dangerous mission, where her skills would be essential to success. But as the aircraft lifted off from Fort Campbell, carrying them toward Eastern Europe and an uncertain confrontation with hostile forces, Audrey couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would test more than just her technical capabilities. Something about the intelligence briefing had felt incomplete, as if there were aspects of the situation they hadn't been told about. She was right to be concerned. The mission they thought they were going on was complex enough, but the reality waiting for them in the mountains of Eastern Europe would prove to be far more dangerous and challenging than anything they'd been briefed to expect. And when everything went wrong, when the carefully planned operation collapsed into chaos and survival, Audrey Parker would discover exactly what she was capable of when faced with the ultimate test. But that crisis was still days away. For now, she was simply a soldier heading into harm's way with a team that had finally learned to trust her capabilities. Soon, that trust would be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The helicopter insertion went wrong from the moment they crossed into contested airspace. What should have been a routine night approach to their landing zone became a harrowing flight through mountain valleys under heavy cloud cover, with the pilot struggling to maintain visual reference points in near-zero visibility conditions. Audrey Parker pressed her face to the small window of the Black Hawk helicopter, watching the terrain rush past in the green glow of her night vision goggles. The mountains of Eastern Europe were far more imposing than anything she'd experienced during training, with jagged peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds and valleys that seemed to swallow all available light. 2 minutes to LZ, the crew chief announced over the intercom, his voice tight with concentration. Through her headset, Audrey could hear the pilots' communication with their escort aircraft, discussing weather conditions and potential threats. In clipped, professional tones that did nothing to hide their concern, Staff Sergeant Thompson checked his watch and looked around at his team. One final time. Bravo team was loaded with 72 hours of supplies, specialized communications equipment, and enough firepower to handle a significant engagement. But looking at the terrain passing beneath them, Audrey couldn't shake the feeling that they were inserting into a situation far more complex than their intelligence briefing had suggested. The helicopter began its descent into the designated landing zone, a small clearing approximately 6 kilometers from the NATO monitoring station. As they dropped below the cloud layer, Audrey got her first clear view of their operational area. The landscape was a maze of steep ridges, deep valleys, and dense forest that would make movement challenging and navigation critical. "LZ is hot." The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "I'm seeing muzzle flashes from the ridgeline to the east. We need to get you on the ground fast and get out of here." The helicopter flared hard, touching down with a jarring impact that set equipment sliding across the cabin floor. Thompson was already moving toward the door, hand signals directing his team into their practice disembarkation routine. "Go, go, go!" the crew chief shouted, and Bravo team poured out of the helicopter into the cold mountain air. Audrey hit the ground running, her communications pack secure on her shoulders and her weapon ready. Around her, the team spread out into a defensive perimeter as the helicopter lifted off behind them with a roar of rotors and turbine engines. The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. They were alone in hostile territory, 6 soldiers against whatever forces controlled these mountains. Audrey immediately began setting up her primary communications equipment, while the rest of the team established security. "Base, this is Bravo. Team," she transmitted on their encrypted frequency. "Insertion complete, establishing operations." The response came back weak and distorted, barely audible through the static. "Bravo team base. Confirm your position and status." Audrey frowned at the poor signal quality. They were only 6 kilometers from their primary objective, and she was already experiencing communications difficulties that hadn't been anticipated during mission planning. She quickly switched to her backup frequency and tried again, with only marginal improvement. Thompson crawled over to her position. "What's the communication status?" "Problematic," Audrey replied, adjusting her antenna array. "I'm getting significant interference on all primary frequencies. It could be atmospheric conditions, but it could also be deliberate jamming." The possibility of electronic warfare added a new dimension of threat to their mission. If hostile forces were actively jamming communications, it suggested a level of sophistication and preparation that went beyond what they'd been briefed to expect. "Can you work around it?" Audrey was already switching to her contingency communications plan. "I'm setting up the relay stations we discussed. If I can get repeaters positioned on those ridges, we should be able to establish reliable contact." She paused, listening to another burst of static-filled transmission from base. "But it's going to take time, and we'll need to split the team to emplace the equipment." Thompson considered their tactical situation. They were already behind schedule due to difficult insertion, and losing communications would make their reconnaissance mission exponentially more dangerous. But establishing reliable contact with base was essential for mission success and their own survival. "Davis, Williams, you're with Parker to establish the primary relay station. Shun and Martinez will come with me to begin movement toward the objective. Hayes, you establish our base camp here and monitor for any signs of hostile activity." Audrey gathered the specialized equipment she needed for the relay station and checked her GPS coordinates one final time. The primary relay position was located on a ridge approximately 1,200 meters above their current position, requiring a steep climb through terrain that would test everyone's endurance and navigation skills. The ascent began in darkness, with the team moving in single file through dense forest that muffled sound, but also concealed their movement from potential observers. Audrey found herself in the middle of the formation, with Davis leading and Williams providing rear security. The communications equipment added significant weight to her load, but the training exercises at Fort Campbell had prepared her for exactly this kind of movement. As they climbed, Audrey began to notice details about their environment that troubled her. The forest showed signs of recent human activity, broken branches, disturbed soil, and what appeared to be observation positions that had been abandoned recently enough that the vegetation hadn't grown back. Someone had been operating in this area with enough frequency to leave a trail. "Davis," she whispered during one of their brief halts, "are you seeing the signs of activity in this area?" Davis nodded grimly. "Been tracking it for the last 20 minutes. Someone's been using this route regularly and recently." He paused, studying a section of disturbed earth. "Military boots, multiple individuals, maybe within the last week." The implications were concerning. If hostile forces were operating in the same area they were using for their relay station, The mission was already more compromised than they'd anticipated. But establishing communications remained their highest priority, regardless of the risks involved. They reached the relay position just as dawn began to break over the mountains, revealing a landscape of stunning beauty and obvious tactical complexity. From their elevated position, Audrey could see multiple valleys, ridge lines that extended in every direction, and in the distance, what appeared to be the monitoring station they'd been sent to investigate. But what captured her immediate attention was the column of smoke rising from the vicinity of the NATO facility. "Base, this is Bravo Team Relay," Audrey transmitted, using the improved line-of-sight position to establish clear contact. "We have eyes on the objective area and observe smoke and possible fire damage to the monitoring station." The response was immediate and clear. "Bravo Team Relay, confirm visual contact with the objective. What is the status of the facility?" Audrey adjusted her binoculars and studied the distant building complex. Even from several kilometers away, she could see evidence of significant damage. "Base, the monitoring station shows signs of attack. Multiple buildings appear damaged, and there's evidence of ongoing fire or recent burning. No signs of friendly activity." Thompson's voice came through her earpiece. "Parker, can you see any signs of hostile forces in the area?" Audrey swept the terrain around the monitoring station with her optics, looking for movement, vehicles, or defensive positions. What she saw made her blood run cold. "Sergeant Thompson, I'm observing what appears to be an organized defensive perimeter around the monitoring station. Multiple fighting positions, at least 2 vehicle emplacements, and coordinated patrol patterns. This isn't a raid or random attack. Someone has occupied the facility and is defending it." The mission had just become exponentially more complex. Instead of conducting reconnaissance on an abandoned or damaged facility, they were looking at an occupied enemy position with unknown numbers of hostile forces who had prepared defensive positions and were clearly expecting opposition. Williams, who had been monitoring the tactical radio frequency, turned to Audrey with a grim expression. "Parker, we've got another problem. I'm picking up radio traffic on enemy frequencies, and it sounds like they know we're here." Audrey quickly tuned her intercept equipment to the frequencies Williams had identified. The voices were speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but the tactical nature of the communications was unmistakable. Grid coordinates, movement reports, and what sounded like alert notifications. "They're coordinating search patterns," Audrey reported to Thompson. "Whatever operational security we had is blown. They know we're in the area, and they're actively looking for us." The relay station that was supposed to provide them with secure communications had inadvertently revealed their presence to a well-organized enemy force that was now mobilizing to find and eliminate them. The reconnaissance mission was rapidly evolving into a survival situation, and they were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in terrain that favored the defenders. As Audrey completed the setup of her communications relay, she realized that the next few hours would determine whether Bravo Team would successfully complete their mission or become casualties of a situation that had been far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The mountains of Eastern Europe had already proven more challenging than the Cumberland training grounds. Soon, they would become a testing ground for everything Audrey Parker had learned about survival, leadership, and the true meaning of courage under fire. But first, they had to survive the next 24 hours. And based on the enemy radio traffic she was monitoring, that was going to require every skill they possessed, and some they hadn't even discovered yet. The ambush came at the worst possible moment, when Bravo Team was spread across the mountainside with their communications relay only half established. Audrey Parker was fine-tuning the antenna array when the first mortar round exploded 50 meters below their position, sending rocks and debris cascading down the slope. "Contact! Contact!" Davis shouted into his radio as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around them. The enemy had used the terrain expertly, positioning themselves to create a crossfire that made staying in their current location impossible. Williams suppressed that position to the north. Thompson's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Parker, we need to abandon the relay station and move to alternate position." Audrey was already breaking down her equipment, her training taking over despite the chaos around them. She could hear bullets snapping through the air overhead and the distinctive sound of more mortar being fired in their direction. The enemy had found them faster than anyone had anticipated, and they brought significant firepower to the engagement. "Davis, covering fire!" she called out, slinging her communications pack and grabbing the most critical pieces of relay equipment. Some of the gear would have to be abandoned, but she could salvage enough to maintain basic communications if they could. Reach safety. The withdrawal down the mountainside was a controlled chaos of movement and suppressive fire. Williams and Davis bounded backward in alternating rushes while Audrey moved with her equipment and Thompson coordinated their escape route. But the enemy had positioned themselves to channel any retreat into a specific valley, and they were being herded exactly where their attackers wanted them to go. "Thompson to all elements," came the staff sergeant's voice over the radio. "We're being pushed toward the East Valley. Hayes, can you provide overwatch from base camp?" Specialist Hayes' response was immediate and alarming. "Negative. Base camp is under attack. At least 2 squads moving on our position. I'm displacing to alternate site." The tactical situation was collapsing rapidly. Bravo team was scattered across the mountainside, under attack from multiple directions, with their base camp compromised and their extraction point potentially occupied by hostile forces. Audrey realized they were dealing with a much larger and more sophisticated enemy force than intelligence had suggested. As they descended into the valley, another mortar barrage forced them to take cover behind a cluster of large boulders. During the brief respite, Thompson gathered the team for a hasty tactical assessment. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," he said grimly. "Our primary mission is blown, and right now survival is the priority. We need to reach the emergency extraction point and get out of here." Audrey checked her GPS coordinates and compared them to their planned escape routes. What she saw made her stomach sink. "Sergeant Thompson, the emergency extraction point is 12 kilometers through terrain that's completely exposed to observation from the ridges. If they have the manpower to attack multiple positions simultaneously, they can easily intercept US before we reach safety. Then what do you suggest?" Thompson asked, trusting Audrey's tactical analysis despite the pressure of their situation. Audrey studied the topographic features around them, looking for options that would give them an advantage despite their numerical disadvantage. "There's a secondary valley system to the south that leads toward the border. It's longer, but it provides better concealment and multiple escape routes. If we can reach that terrain, we can avoid the main enemy forces and work our way to a more secure extraction point." Williams looked skeptical. "That route takes us farther into enemy territory, not away from it." "Sometimes the most dangerous route is the safest one," Audrey replied. "They'll expect us to run for the nearest extraction point. If we move deeper into their territory, we might get behind their search pattern." Thompson was about to respond when another burst of automatic weapons fire forced them back into cover. When he raised his head to assess their situation, his expression was grim. "We've got movement on 3 sides," he reported. "They're trying to encircle us. Parker, lead US toward that southern route. Davis and Williams rear guard. Move now." The movement through the valley became a running firefight, with enemy forces maintaining contact but never fully committing to a decisive engagement. It was a pursuit tactic designed to drive them toward a predetermined killing zone, and Audrey realized they were being herded like animals toward slaughter. "Thompson," she called during a brief halt, "they're not trying to stop us here. They're pushing us toward something." Before Thompson could respond, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley. But instead of the friendly extraction aircraft they hoped for, an enemy helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, immediately beginning to search the area with powerful spotlights. "Everyone down!" Thompson shouted, but it was too late. The helicopter had spotted their movement and was already coordinating with ground forces to box them in. The next few minutes became a desperate game of hide and seek among the rocks and sparse vegetation of the valley floor. The helicopter maintained overwatch while ground forces closed in from multiple directions. Audrey found herself separated from the main group when a burst of machine gun fire from the aircraft forced her to take cover behind a small cluster of trees. "Parker, report your position." Thompson's voice came through her earpiece, but it was weak and distorted by interference. "I'm approximately 200 meters south of your last position," Audrey transmitted back. "Heavy interference on communications. The helicopter is jamming our frequencies." What happened next would haunt Audrey for the rest of her life. Through her night vision goggles, she watched as Thompson, Davis, and Williams attempted to reach her position. The enemy had anticipated their movement and positioned a machine gun team to cover the exact route they would have to use. The ambush was swift and devastating. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions as the three soldiers were caught in a crossfire. Audrey could see them taking cover and returning fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Parker!" Thompson's voice was strained with pain and urgency. "We're pinned down and taking casualties. You need to get to the extraction point and call for support." "That's an order." "Negative. I'm coming to your position. Parker, listen to me." Thompson's transmission was breaking up with static and interference. "The mission is blown, but someone needs to survive to report what we found here. This enemy force is bigger than anything we were briefed about. Intelligence needs to know what they're dealing with." Audrey could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing. More enemy forces were converging on Thompson's position, and the helicopter was directing their movement with devastating effectiveness. "Get to the extraction point." Thompson's final transmission was barely audible through the static. "That's a direct order. Complete the mission, Parker. Get home and tell them what happened here." The radio went silent except for the hiss of static. Through her optics, Audrey could see that the enemy forces had overrun Thompson's position. The distinctive sound signatures of American weapons had stopped, replaced by the organized movement of hostile forces consolidating their victory. Audrey Parker was alone behind enemy lines, with no support, limited equipment, and at least 2 companies of enemy soldiers actively searching for her. Everything that had defined her identity as a soldier, her team, her mission, her support structure, had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. But as she crouched in the darkness, listening to enemy forces coordinate their search patterns over captured radio frequencies, something fundamental shifted in Audrey's mind. The voices that had once called her fragile and porcelain seemed to come from another lifetime. The woman hiding in these mountains was someone different, someone forged by loss, responsibility, and the absolute necessity of survival. She had 72 hours to reach friendly territory and report what Bravo team had discovered. 72 hours to cross hostile terrain while avoiding enemy patrols, surveillance, and pursuit. 72 hours to prove that the smallest member of the team could survive what had killed the strongest. But first, she had to disappear into the mountains. That had become both her prison and her only hope of salvation. The real test of Audrey Parker was about to begin, and she would discover that being called fragile had prepared her for something that brute strength alone could never accomplish. The enemy was closing in, but they were hunting someone who no longer existed. The frightened communications specialist was gone, replaced by a soldier who understood that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest. It was about being smart enough, determined enough, and adaptable enough to do whatever it took to complete the mission. even if it meant spending the next 3 days proving that the most dangerous predator in these mountains was the one everyone had underestimated. The first rule of survival behind enemy lines is to become invisible. And Audrey Parker was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way possible. As dawn broke over the mountains of Eastern Europe, she found herself alone with nothing but her communications equipment, her sidearm, and the growing realization that an entire enemy force was systematically hunting her from her concealed position. In a dense thicket of mountain pine, Audrey could hear the methodical search pattern developing around her. Dogs barking in the distance, the mechanical sound of vehicles moving along mountain roads, and most ominously, the steady thrum of helicopters conducting aerial reconnaissance. They weren't just looking for her, they were conducting a military operation designed to ensure she never left these mountains alive. Through her binoculars, she watched enemy soldiers establish checkpoints on every major route out of the valley. They moved with the precision of professional military units, not the irregular forces that intelligence had suggested. These men had training, equipment, and most importantly, they had numbers. Audrey counted at least 40 soldiers visible from her position, and she knew that represented only a fraction of the total force. Her communications equipment crackled with intercepted enemy transmissions, and what she heard made her blood run cold. They weren't just searching for one escaped American soldier. They were treating her as a high-value target whose capture or elimination was worth significant resources. Someone had given these forces detailed information about Bravo teams' mission, their capabilities, and their planned routes. Unit 7 maintained perimeter on the eastern approaches. The target is a communications specialist with advanced technical training. Do not underestimate her capabilities. The voice speaking in accented English was calm, professional, and terrifyingly well-informed. They knew exactly who she was and what she could do. This wasn't a random encounter with hostile forces. This was a carefully planned operation, and Bravo team had walked directly into a trap. Audrey forced herself to think tactically despite the overwhelming fear and grief threatening to paralyze her. Thompson's final order had been clear: survive and report what they'd discovered. That meant she needed to reach friendly territory with intelligence about the true nature of the enemy force operating in this region. But first, she had to avoid capture for long enough to analyze the situation and plan her escape. She carefully inventoried her available resources. Her communications pack contained a short-range tactical radio, a satellite communication device with limited battery life, emergency rations for 3 days, basic medical supplies, and her encryption equipment. Her personal gear included her sidearm with 3 spare magazines, a combat knife, night vision goggles, and the survival equipment that was standard issue for special operations personnel. It wasn't much against a force that size, but Audrey had advantages they didn't know about. Her small stature, which had been seen as a weakness, would now allow her to move through terrain that larger soldiers couldn't navigate. Her communications training meant she could monitor their radio traffic and potentially disrupt their coordination. Most importantly, they expected her to run for the nearest extraction point, which meant they would concentrate their search in the wrong areas. The key was to do exactly what no one expected. Instead of trying to escape immediately, she would move deeper into enemy territory, gather intelligence about their true capabilities, and then find a way to transmit that information to NATO forces before attempting her own extraction. As the morning progressed, Audrey watched the enemy search pattern develop with professional interest. They were using standard counter-infiltration techniques, but adapted for mountain terrain. Roadblocks on major routes, foot patrols on likely hiding spots, aerial reconnaissance for movement detection, and coordinated sweeps of potential escape. Corridors. It was textbook procedure, which meant it could be countered if she was smart enough and patient enough. The first opportunity came when she observed a patrol passing below her position. 3 soldiers moving in tactical formation, checking caves and overhangs where a fugitive might hide. They were thorough but predictable, following a search pattern that she could anticipate and avoid. More importantly, she noticed that their radio communications were following a specific schedule. Every 15 minutes, each patrol leader reported their position and status to a central coordination point. That communication discipline gave her windows of radio silence when she could move without being detected by their intercept capabilities. During one of these silent periods, Audrey began her first movement since the ambush. She couldn't stay in her current position. Eventually, the systematic search would find her. But instead of moving toward safety, she began working her way parallel to the enemy search line, staying just outside their sweep pattern. While gathering information about their deployment, what she discovered over the next several hours was far worse than anyone at NATO headquarters had imagined. This wasn't a paramilitary group or a regular force. These were professional soldiers with modern equipment, sophisticated communications, and tactical knowledge that suggested formal military training. They had heavy weapons positions, armored vehicles, and most concerningly, they had intelligence about NATO operations that should have been classified. As evening approached, Audrey found herself on a ridge overlooking the captured NATO monitoring station. Through her binoculars, she could see the true extent of the enemy occupation. They hadn't just attacked the facility, they had turned it into a fortified base with defensive positions, communications arrays, and what appeared to be a prisoner-holding area. But what made her stomach clench with horror was the sight of familiar uniforms in that holding area. The 12-person international team that had staffed the monitoring station was still alive, but they were being held as prisoners. The mission had just become exponentially more complex. Using her secure satellite communicator, Audrey composed a brief encrypted message to NATO headquarters. Bravo team compromised. Enemy force significantly larger than briefed. Professional military unit with advanced capabilities. Original monitoring team alive but captured. Require immediate assistance. The response came back within minutes. Message received. Maintain position and avoid detection. Support en route. Estimated arrival 48 hours. 48 hours. Audrey had to survive for 48 more hours while avoiding an enemy force that was actively hunting her, all while gathering intelligence and maintaining surveillance on the captured NATO personnel. The mission parameters had changed completely, but the core objective remained the same: survive and report. As darkness fell, Audrey made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the fragile communications specialist who had joined Alpha Company months earlier. Instead of hiding and waiting for rescue, she was going to take active measures to gather intelligence and, if possible, help the captured NATO personnel. The enemy had made one crucial mistake in their assessment of her capabilities. They were hunting a frightened, isolated soldier who would try to escape as quickly as possible. Instead, they were dealing with someone who had been systematically underestimated her entire military career and had learned to turn that disadvantage into a tactical advantage. That night, as enemy patrols swept the mountains with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, Audrey Parker began to do something that no one friend or enemy thought she was capable of. She went hunting, not for targets to eliminate, but for information to gather, communications to intercept, and opportunities to demonstrate that the most dangerous opponent is often the one you dismiss as harmless. The soldiers searching for her were looking for prey. What they found instead was a predator who had learned to survive by being smarter, quieter, and more determined than anyone expected. The next 36 hours would test every skill she had ever learned and reveal capabilities she didn't know she possessed. The mountains that had claimed her teammates would either become her grave or her proving ground. And the enemy forces that had planned her capture were about to discover that their assumptions about the fragile American soldier were not just wrong, they were dangerously, fatally wrong. But first she had to survive the night while dogs, tractors sent, and helicopters swept the ridges with searchlights. The real hunt was just beginning, and Audrey Parker was no longer running from it. She was preparing to turn it around on her pursuers. The second night behind enemy lines taught Audrey Parker that survival wasn't just about staying hidden. It was about controlling information. As she crept through the darkness toward the captured NATO monitoring station, every shadow could conceal an enemy sentry, and every sound could trigger an alarm that would bring the entire enemy force down on her position. But Audrey had discovered something crucial during her first 24 hours of being hunted. Her small size and communications expertise gave her capabilities that her pursuers hadn't anticipated. While they searched for an escaped soldier trying to reach safety, she was systematically infiltrating their operation and gathering intelligence that would change NATO's understanding of the threat they faced. Moving through the forest with painstaking care, Audrey reached an observation position approximately 300 meters from the monitoring station. Through her night vision equipment, she could see the full extent of the enemy's fortification efforts. They hadn't just captured the facility, they had transformed it into a sophisticated intelligence collection center. The original NATO monitoring equipment was still operational, but now it was being used to intercept Allied communications throughout the region. Worse, they had installed additional electronic warfare equipment that was actively jamming NATO frequencies while leaving their own communications unaffected. This wasn't a simple military occupation, it was a carefully planned intelligence operation, using her tactical radio on a frequency she knew the enemy wasn't monitoring. Audrey began documenting everything she observed: vehicle types, personnel counts, weapon systems, communication arrays, and most importantly, the evidence that this force had capabilities far beyond anything NATO intelligence had assessed. They have at least 2 companies of professional soldiers, she whispered into her encrypted recorder. Modern Russian small arms, vehicle-mounted anti-aircraft systems, and electronic warfare capabilities sufficient to control the entire communication spectrum in this region. This isn't a paramilitary group. This is a specialized military unit with a specific mission. But the most disturbing discovery came when she focused her binoculars on the prisoner-holding area. The 12 NATO personnel were being systematically interrogated, and the questioning wasn't random. The enemy had detailed knowledge of NATO communication protocols, intelligence procedures, and operational plans that should have been classified at the highest levels. Someone had provided them with inside information that went far beyond what a captured monitoring station could yield. This operation had been planned with access to NATO intelligence, which meant there was either a security breach or an active intelligence penetration that compromised multiple operations. As Audrey documented the evidence, she began to understand why Bravo team had been so perfectly ambushed. Their mission parameters, insertion timing, and operational routes had likely been known to the enemy before they ever left Fort Campbell. They hadn't been sent on a reconnaissance mission. They had been sent into a trap designed to eliminate witnesses to this larger operation. The realization was both terrifying and energizing. If she could gather enough evidence and successfully transmit it to NATO headquarters, the intelligence value would be enormous. But if she was captured or killed, the enemy would have successfully eliminated the only witness to their true capabilities and objectives. Moving closer to the facility required crossing open ground that was covered by security cameras and roving patrols. But Audrey had been studying their security pattern for hours, and she'd identified a blind spot created by the positioning of their equipment. It would require precise timing and absolute silence, but she could reach a position where she could intercept their communications directly rather than relying on distant observation. The infiltration took nearly 2 hours of careful movement, but by midnight Audrey had positioned herself in a drainage culvert that ran beneath the monitoring station's perimeter. The concrete tunnel was cramped and uncomfortable, but it provided concealment and, more importantly, access to the communications cables that connected the enemy's equipment. Using tools from her communications kit, Audrey carefully spliced into the enemy's data transmission lines. It was a technique she'd learned during advanced training, but this was the first time she'd attempted it under operational conditions with the knowledge that discovery meant certain death. What she found in the enemy communications exceeded her worst fears. They weren't just intercepting NATO communications, they were actively manipulating them. False intelligence reports, altered operational orders, and compromised encryption keys that would allow them to monitor and control Allied operations throughout the region. But the most shocking discovery was a communication schedule showing planned attacks on multiple NATO facilities across Eastern Europe. The monitoring station was just the beginning of a coordinated campaign designed to eliminate NATO's intelligence collection capabilities while maintaining the appearance of random terrorist attacks. Audrey quickly copied the relevant files to her own equipment while documenting the enemy's communication protocols. This intelligence needed to reach NATO headquarters immediately, but transmitting from her current position would expose her location and likely result in her immediate capture. She had to find a way to get this information out while continuing to gather evidence about the scope of the enemy operation. More importantly, she was beginning to formulate a plan that could potentially disrupt their activities and possibly even extract the captured NATO personnel. As she prepared to withdraw from her infiltration position, Audrey overheard a conversation that made her freeze in terror. Two enemy officers were discussing the final phase of their operation, which included the execution of all captured NATO personnel once their interrogation was complete. "The intelligence value of the prisoners has been exhausted," one voice said. In accented English, "Moscow Center has authorized final disposition tomorrow evening. Make it look like an escape attempt that required lethal force." Audrey's tactical situation had just become impossible. She had critical intelligence that needed to reach NATO headquarters immediately, but she also had less than 18 hours before 12 innocent people would be murdered. There was no way she could accomplish both missions alone, but there was also no way she could choose between them. As she crept back through the drainage tunnel toward her escape route, Audrey began planning the most audacious operation of her military career. She was going to use her communications expertise to coordinate a rescue mission while simultaneously ensuring that the intelligence she'd gathered reached NATO command. It would require everything she'd learned about communications, tactics, and survival. More importantly, it would require her to take actions that went far beyond anything expected from a fragile communications specialist who was supposed to be hiding in the mountains waiting for rescue. But as Audrey emerged from the tunnel and began moving back toward her observation position, she realized that the frightened soldier who had joined Alpha Company months ago no longer existed. The woman moving through these mountains had been forged by loss, tested by isolation, and shaped by the absolute necessity of completing an impossible mission. The enemy had made the mistake of believing their own assessment of her capabilities. They were hunting someone who didn't exist anymore, while the real Audrey Parker was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate completely. She had 16 hours to save 12 lives and prevent intelligence disaster that could compromise NATO operations throughout Eastern Europe against professional soldiers in fortified positions with superior numbers and equipment. But she also had advantages they couldn't anticipate: the communication skills to coordinate external support, the tactical knowledge to exploit their operational security weaknesses, and most importantly, the determination of someone who had been called fragile her entire career and was finally in a position to prove exactly how wrong that assessment had been. The final phase of her 72 hours behind enemy lines was about to begin, and it would either be her greatest triumph or her final mission. But failure was no longer an option, because too many lives depended on her success, and she had come too far to let anyone else pay the price for underestimating her capabilities. The final 16 hours of Audrey Parker's 72-hour ordeal would redefine everything NATO intelligence thought they knew about individual capability under extreme circumstances. As dawn approached on her third day behind enemy lines, she was no longer the hunted fugitive the enemy expected to find cowering. In the mountains, she had become something far more dangerous, a force multiplier who was about to turn her communications expertise into the weapon that would save 12 lives and expose an international conspiracy. Working from her concealed position overlooking the monitoring station, Audrey began implementing a plan that would have seemed impossible to anyone who remembered the fragile communications specialist from Fort Campbell. Using her encrypted satellite communicator, she established contact with NATO Special Operations Command and transmitted the intelligence she had gathered about the enemy's true capabilities and planned attacks. Priority flash traffic, she transmitted, in compressed data bursts designed to avoid detection. Enemy forces professional military unit with advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Multiple NATO facilities targeted for coordinated attacks. Captured personnel scheduled for execution at 1800 hours today. Request immediate authorization for emergency intervention. The response came back within 30 minutes. Authorization granted. Execute at your discretion. Support assets en route, but will not arrive before prisoner execution deadline. You are authorized to take whatever action necessary to preserve NATO personnel and intelligence. For the first time in her military career, Audrey Parker had been given complete operational authority for a combat mission. The irony wasn't lost on her, the same woman who had been dismissed as too fragile for real military operations was now tasked with executing the most complex single-handed rescue mission in recent NATO history. Her plan depended on exploiting the one advantage she possessed that the enemy couldn't counter: their complete underestimation of her capabilities. They were still searching for an escaped communications specialist who should be trying to flee the area. Instead, they were about to face a soldier who had turned their own electronic warfare capabilities against them. Using the enemy communication protocols she had intercepted, Audrey began implementing a sophisticated deception operation. She transmitted false patrol reports suggesting that she had been spotted moving toward the border, drawing search teams away from the monitoring station. Simultaneously, she used her access to their communication system to create confusion about patrol schedules and security assignments. The psychological warfare began at noon, when Audrey used the enemy's own public address system to broadcast a message in perfect English to the soldiers occupying this facility. You are surrounding and hunting a single American communications specialist. Consider what it means that she has been able to penetrate your communications, monitor your operations, and broadcast this message without being detected. Your operational security is compromised. Your mission is blown. And in 6 hours you will discover exactly why underestimating your opponents is a fatal mistake. The effect was immediate and visible. Through her binoculars, Audrey could see increased activity around the monitoring station, with officers gathering, animated discussions, and security patrols being reinforced. More importantly, she could monitor their radio traffic as confusion and paranoia began to spread through their ranks. How is one person doing this? Came one intercepted transmission. She should be running for the border, not conducting psychological operations against a fortified position. But Audrey was just getting started. Using her technical knowledge of electronic warfare systems, she began systematically disrupting the enemy's equipment. Their GPS navigation became unreliable. Their encrypted communications started experiencing mysterious interference. Their surveillance cameras developed intermittent connectivity problems that created blind spots in their security coverage. Each disruption was small and could be attributed to equipment malfunction, but the cumulative effect was to create doubt, frustration, and the growing realization that they were dealing with someone far more capable than they had anticipated. As afternoon approached, Audrey moved into position for the most dangerous phase of her operation. She had identified a weakness in the enemy security perimeter, a section of their defensive line that relied heavily on electronic surveillance rather than physical patrols. If she could disable their sensors without triggering alarms, she could penetrate the facility and reach the prisoner-holding area. The infiltration required everything she had learned about stealth movement, electronic warfare, and tactical patience. Moving through the forest in broad daylight, Audrey systematically disabled motion sensors, camera systems, and communication relays using techniques that made each failure appear to be a random malfunction rather than sabotage. It took 4 hours to reach the perimeter of the monitoring station, and by then the enemy was clearly aware that their security systems were being compromised by someone with sophisticated technical knowledge. What they didn't know was that the person responsible was already inside their defensive perimeter and moving toward the building that held the NATO prisoners. At 1700 hours, 1 hour before the scheduled executions, Audrey reached the prisoner holding facility. Through a basement window, she could see the 12 NATO personnel who had been held captive for nearly a week. They were obviously exhausted and frightened, but they were alert and responsive. They could move quickly if given the opportunity. Using hand signals through the window, Audrey identified herself to the senior NATO officer, a British colonel who immediately understood that a rescue attempt was underway. She passed him a small radio and a written message explaining that external support was en route, but would arrive too late to prevent the executions. The rescue had to happen in the next 30 minutes. The plan Audrey communicated was audacious in its simplicity. At exactly 1730 hours, she would create a massive distraction that would draw the guards away from the prisoner facility. The NATO personnel would have approximately 10 minutes to escape through the basement window and reach a rally point in the forest where Audrey would guide them to safety. But first, she had to create a distraction significant enough to occupy the attention of an entire enemy company. And she had to do it with nothing but her communications equipment and her knowledge of their electronic warfare systems. At 1730 hours precisely, every piece of electronic equipment in the monitoring station began malfunctioning simultaneously. Communication systems broadcast static on all frequencies. Computer networks crashed and rebooted in endless loops. Security cameras displayed false alarms, while actual alarms failed to trigger. The GPS guidance systems for their vehicles began providing random coordinates, but the masterpiece of Audrey's electronic warfare campaign was her use of their own public address system to broadcast what appeared to be incoming artillery fire coordinates, complete with realistic sound effects of approaching shells that she generated using audio equipment from her communications kit. The effect was panic. Enemy soldiers abandoned their posts and took cover from an artillery barrage that existed only in their communication systems. In the confusion, 12 NATO prisoners slipped out of their holding facility and disappeared into the forest, guided by the same woman, who had been dismissed as too fragile for real military operations. The extraction to the rally point took 40 minutes through terrain that Audrey now knew better than the enemy forces who had been hunting her for 3 days. As NATO helicopters finally arrived to extract the rescued personnel, Audrey transmitted her final report to headquarters. Mission complete. All personnel extracted successfully. Enemy capabilities and planned operations documented and transmitted. Recommend immediate countermeasures to prevent attacks on additional NATO facilities. 3 months later, Captain Audrey Parker stood in the Pentagon briefing room where senior NATO officials were reviewing the intelligence she had gathered during her 72 hours behind enemy lines. The evidence she had collected had prevented attacks on 17 NATO facilities and exposed a Russian intelligence operation that had penetrated multiple allied organizations. Captain Parker, the NATO Secretary General, said at the conclusion of the briefing, Your actions represent one of the most significant single-handed intelligence and rescue operations in modern military history. You prevented a major intelligence disaster and saved the lives of 12 NATO personnel. But for Audrey, the real victory wasn't the medals or the commendations. It was the knowledge that she had finally definitively proven that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous enemies are often those you dismiss as harmless. She had been called fragile and porcelain by people who measured capability by size and assumed that quiet competence indicated weakness. Behind enemy lines, surrounded by professional soldiers who wanted her dead, she had demonstrated that true strength isn't about being the biggest or the loudest. It's about being smart enough, determined enough, and adaptable enough to accomplish the impossible when everything depends on your success. The woman who had once been considered too delicate for real military operations had become living proof that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield is the soldier everyone underestimates. And in the mountains of Eastern Europe, Audrey Parker had written the definitive manual on how to turn that underestimation into victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.